Wealthy CEO humiliates a janitor in front of everyone, but when he discovers her real identity, his world starts to change in ways he never expected. The day began like any other at G-Tech Enterprises, a company that boasted sleek glass walls, polished marble floors, and the hum of relentless activity. The headquarters, a towering symbol of corporate power, was already buzzing with the energy of Monday morning as employees hurried to their desks, clutching cups of coffee and briefcases. At the top floor, overlooking it all, Joshua Graves, the CEO, sat in his office, fuming. His morning had been ruined by a disastrous board meeting that had left him seething with anger and frustration. The investors had questioned his leadership, something that bruised his enormous ego deeply. Joshua, known for his fiery temper, slammed his office door behind him and stormed out, determined to find a way to regain control. As he marched through the hallway, his sharp eyes caught sight of something that only added to his fury. A small spill of coffee, creating a stain on the otherwise immaculate floor. It was a minor mess, something most people would overlook. But to Joshua, it was an insult to the perfection he demanded. His gaze zeroed in on a figure kneeling nearby, a janitor scrubbing at the spill with deliberate care. Elena had almost finished cleaning the spill when she felt the prickling awareness of someone watching her. She looked up, meeting the cold, piercing eyes of Joshua Graves. There was a brief moment where neither spoke, but the tension was palpable. Then, without warning, Joshua's voice cut through the air like a knife. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped, his tone dripping with disdain. "Are you really this incompetent? Can't even clean up a simple spill without taking forever?" Elena's face flushed with embarrassment, but she held her tongue, continuing her work. Joshua's words echoed through the corridor, drawing the attention of several passing employees who slowed their steps, curious about the commotion. Joshua's tirade continued, each word more cutting than the last. "You're lazy, useless," he spat. "This is what we pay you for? To sit around and let the place turn into a mess?" Despite the humiliation, Elena remained silent, her hands moving swiftly to finish cleaning. She had been prepared for moments like this when she decided to take on the role of a janitor. It was a humble position, one far below her actual status, but it allowed her to see the company through unfiltered eyes. Her father had always believed in understanding every level of the business, and this was her way of honoring that legacy. But today, the weight of her secret felt heavier than ever as she listened to Joshua's cruel words. As soon as she finished cleaning, Elena gathered her supplies and retreated to a quieter part of the building, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and shame. The other employees who had witnessed the scene exchanged uneasy glances, some murmuring under their breath about Joshua's harshness. However, none dared to intervene or speak up in her defense. The CEO's wrath was infamous, and no one wanted to become the next target. Elena kept her head down, moving quickly to a less populated area where she could collect herself away from the scrutinizing eyes of her coworkers. Inside, Elena's emotions churned. She had never felt so small, so devalued in the very company her father had built with his blood, sweat, and tears. But she couldn't afford to let her true feelings show. For now, she would remain in the shadows, observing, learning. The pain of the moment would serve as a reminder of why she was here and what she had to do. As she took a deep breath, the echo of Joshua's words lingered in her mind. Little did he know, the tables would soon turn, and the lesson he so harshly tried to teach would come back to haunt him in ways he could never imagine. Elena found refuge in a small storage room tucked away on the building's lower level. The familiar scent of cleaning supplies and the dim lighting provided a strange sense of comfort, a stark contrast to the harshness she had just endured. Here, surrounded by mops and buckets, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, her mind drifting back to memories of her father. He had been a giant in her eyes, a man of integrity and kindness who built G-Tech from the ground up. His vision was never just about profits or power. It was about people, creating a company that was as much a family as it was a business. After his sudden death, Elena had been thrust into a world of corporate politics and boardroom power struggles. The company he left behind was no longer the tight-knit community it once was. It had grown into a massive enterprise, with layers of management and bureaucracy that sometimes seemed to suffocate the very values her father had cherished. Elena, though grieving, had made a bold decision. Instead of stepping into the role of the heir apparent, she chose to step back. She disguised her identity and took on the role of a janitor, determined to understand the true heartbeat of the company her father had loved so dearly. As she wiped away a stray tear, Elena couldn't help but feel the weight of her father's legacy on her shoulders. She knew he would be heartbroken to see the state of the company today, where people like Joshua Graves could rise to power, treating others with such disdain. Her father had always emphasized that every employee, from the highest executive to the newest janitor, was vital to the company's success. He often said that a company's true strength lay in how it treated those at the bottom, not just those at the top. And yet, here she was, hiding in a storage room, humiliated by the very man who now led G-Tech. The incident with Joshua played over and over in her mind, each repetition sharpening her anger and deepening her resolve. She knew she couldn't continue to stay silent. The company was losing its soul, its heart. The people who worked here were beginning to feel like mere cogs in a machine, rather than valued members of a team. Elena had witnessed it firsthand in the whispered conversations between her fellow janitors, in the tired, defeated expressions of the office staff. It was becoming clear that under Joshua's leadership, G-Tech was drifting away from the principles her father had lived by. Determined not to let her father's legacy be tarnished any further, Elena began to formulate a plan. She would start by gathering information, listening even more closely to the employees, understanding their grievances, and identifying the key players who could help her. She would need allies, people who still believed in what G-Tech was supposed to stand for. It wouldn't be easy, but Elena had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She had her father's determination, and she was going to use it. As she sat in the quiet room, her thoughts turned to how she could expose the toxic culture that had taken root under Joshua's reign. She couldn't just confront him directly, she had to be smart about this. The board of directors was powerful, but they were also cautious, and they wouldn't act without solid proof. Elena knew she had to build a case, something that would force them to see the truth about Joshua and the damage he was doing. And when the time was right, she would reveal who she really was, not just to Joshua, but to the entire company. For now, though, she would continue to play her part, blending into the background, listening, observing. But with each passing day, her resolve grew stronger. Elena was no longer just a janitor. She was the rightful heir to G-Tech, and she would do whatever it took to honor her father's memory and restore the company to its former glory. Joshua returned to his office, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the glass windows. The opulence of the room, with its sleek, black leather chairs and a massive mahogany desk, did little to soothe his frayed nerves. He paced back and forth, trying to shake off the lingering irritation from his encounter with the janitor. It wasn't like him to lose control so publicly, but the stress of the board meeting had pushed him over the edge. He ran a hand through his meticulously styled hair, glancing at his reflection in the window. He couldn't afford any more slip-ups, not with so much at stake. His assistant, a young man named Ryan, cautiously entered the office, holding a tablet with today's schedule. Joshua barely acknowledged him, still lost in his thoughts. Ryan hesitated before speaking, knowing how volatile Joshua could be when things didn't go his way. "Mr. Graves," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "the board is expecting an update on the company's employee satisfaction metrics this afternoon. They've been pushing for more transparency, especially after the last quarterly report." Joshua stopped pacing and turned to face Ryan, his eyes narrowing. "What exactly are you trying to say, Ryan?" he snapped. The assistant swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. I just thought you should know, sir. The board has been more concerned about our internal culture lately. They might be watching today's meeting closely. Joshua waved a dismissive hand, trying to brush off the unease that was beginning to creep into his mind. The board's always watching, he muttered, mostly to himself. They need to remember who's running this company. A little discipline is necessary to keep things in order. But even as he said the words, he couldn't completely shake the nagging doubt that was growing inside him. The company's reputation was one of its most valuable assets, and he had always prided himself on maintaining a strong public image. Yet his actions today felt reckless, even to him. As the day wore on, Joshua's discomfort grew. He couldn't concentrate during meetings, his thoughts repeatedly drifting back to the incident in the hallway. He was used to being in control, to commanding respect, but something about that exchange with the janitor felt different. It wasn't just about the coffee spill, it was the way the employees had looked at him, the whispers that followed as he walked away. He knew people were talking, and in a company this large, rumors had a way of reaching the board's ears. Later in the afternoon, as Joshua was reviewing documents in his office, there was a knock at the door. He looked up to see Sarah, the senior HR executive, standing in the doorway. Sarah was one of the few people in the company who could hold her own against Joshua. She was sharp, professional, and had an uncanny ability to address sensitive issues without directly confronting them. "Joshua, do you have a moment?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Joshua nodded, motioning for her to take a seat. Sarah sat down, crossing her legs neatly and folding her hands in her lap. "I wanted to touch base about something that's come to my attention," she began, choosing her words carefully. "There's been some concern about how employees are being treated, particularly those in lower-level positions." She paused, watching Joshua's reaction. He stiffened slightly but said nothing, so she continued. "It's important that we maintain a positive work environment, especially with the board, so focused on employee satisfaction. Any negative perceptions could impact the company's image, and by extension, your leadership." Joshua's first instinct was to defend himself, to explain that his actions were justified in maintaining discipline. But he could see that Sarah wasn't here to argue. She was here to give him a warning, subtle as it might be. He leaned back in his chair, trying to appear unruffled. "I appreciate your concern, Sarah," he said, his voice measured. "But sometimes tough decisions have to be made to keep things running smoothly. The board knows this." Sarah nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. "Of course, Joshua, but just keep in mind, perception is everything. We need to be careful about how our actions are viewed, especially in today's climate." With that, she rose from her seat, leaving Joshua to mull over her words. As she walked out, Joshua felt the unease settle deeper in his chest. He knew he couldn't afford to ignore the growing discontent among the employees, or the board's interest in it. But for now, his primary concern was protecting his image, even if it meant covering his tracks rather than addressing the real problem. The story of Joshua's harsh outburst spread through the company like wildfire. By the end of the day, almost everyone had heard about the CEO's public berating of Elena. The janitorial staff, who had always admired Elena for her quiet dedication and kindness, were particularly outraged. They gathered in the break room, a small, cluttered space tucked away on the ground floor, where they often shared coffee and conversation during their breaks. Today, however, the usual lighthearted banter was replaced by hushed, angry whispers. "It's not right what he did," muttered Rosa, a young cleaner with a thick accent and a fiery temper. "Elena doesn't deserve that. None of us do." The others nodded in agreement, their faces set in grim expressions. They had all experienced moments of disrespect, but this was different. Elena was one of their own, and she had always treated everyone with dignity, regardless of their position. Now, seeing her humiliated so publicly, they couldn't stay silent. Carlos, a veteran maintenance worker with silver-streaked hair and a calm demeanor, listened quietly from the corner. He had seen many changes in the company over the decades, But this was the first time he felt a deep unease about its future. His loyalty wasn't just to the company, it was to the values it had once stood for, values that seemed to be eroding under Joshua's leadership. Carlos had known Elena's father well. He remembered the man as a visionary, but more importantly, as someone who genuinely cared about his employees. When Elena had come to him, revealing her true identity and her plan to work undercover, Carlos had been both surprised and impressed. Over the months, he had watched her navigate her new role with humility and grace, never once pulling rank or expecting special treatment. She had earned the respect of the entire staff, and Carlos had taken it upon himself to look out for her, just as he had looked out for her father all those years ago. After the break room emptied out, Carlos found Elena sitting on a bench in the small garden behind the building, her usual hiding spot when she needed to think. He walked over, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, and sat beside her. For a moment they sat in silence, the only sounds being the distant hum of the city and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. "You know, your father wouldn't have stood for this," Carlos finally said, his voice low but steady. Elena looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. "I know, Carlos, but it's different now. The company's changed. People are afraid to speak up." Carlos nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Maybe so, but you've got more people on your side than you think. The staff respects you, Elena. They see the way you treat everyone, and they know you're not just another executive. You've got your father's heart. That counts for something." Elena sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she felt the support in his words. "I never wanted to be in the spotlight, Carlos. I just wanted to understand the company, the people who make it run. But after today, I can't just sit by and let this continue. It's not just about me, it's about everyone here." Carlos placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then maybe it's time you showed them who you really are. Not just to the staff, but to the board. They need to know what's really happening under Joshua's watch." Elena considered his suggestion, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had always believed in quiet action, in learning from the ground up. But Carlos was right. Things had reached a tipping point. "You're right," she said finally, her voice filled with newfound resolve. "It's time to take a stand. Not just for myself, but for everyone who's been mistreated." The conversation with Carlos gave Elena the courage she needed. She knew she couldn't do this alone, but with allies like him by her side, she felt stronger, more capable. She would need to be strategic, to gather more support and carefully plan her next steps. But one thing was clear, this was no longer just about her father's legacy. It was about fighting for the soul of the company, for the people who kept it alive every day. And Elena was ready to lead that fight no matter the cost. Joshua arrived at his office earlier than usual the next morning, still brooding over the previous day's events. The city was just waking up, its skyscrapers bathed in the soft early light. But Joshua's mind was anything but calm. As he sipped his coffee and reviewed emails, a new message appeared in his inbox. It had no subject line, just a single attachment. Curious and slightly irritated by the anonymity, he clicked on it, expecting some trivial issue that his assistant should have handled. The image that filled his screen made his heart stop. It was a black and white photograph, old and slightly faded, showing the company's founder, William Daniels, standing proudly beside a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her hair in pigtails, smiling up at her father with adoration. Joshua's eyes widened as he recognized the girl. It was Elena, the janitor he had berated so harshly just the day before. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. How could the founder's daughter be working as a janitor? His hands shook as he quickly closed the email, fear and panic beginning to claw at his insides. He glanced around his office, as if the walls themselves might betray him, his mind racing. If this got out, if anyone discovered that he had humiliated the daughter of William Daniels, his career would be over. The board would never forgive him. The shareholders would turn on him. The media would have a field day, and his name would be forever tarnished. Joshua could feel the cold sweat forming on his forehead as the realization of his mistake sank in deeper. Without wasting another moment, Joshua began his investigation. He had to be sure, to know for certain who Elena really was. He pulled up the company's personnel files, searching for Elena's records. As he read through her file, everything started to fall into place. There were gaps in her employment history, vague references that now seemed intentionally misleading. How had he not seen it before? How had he been so blind? The girl who had been quietly mopping floors was the true heir to the company, the person who should have been in his position. The enormity of his error pressed down on him like a weight, making it difficult to think clearly. Joshua's initial shock soon turned to cold calculation. He couldn't afford to let this get out. He had to find a way to contain the situation. He knew Elena had all the power now, and that thought terrified him. She could destroy him with a single word, reveal him for the tyrant he had become. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a way to keep her quiet. Joshua began to consider his options, each one more desperate than the last. Could he offer her money, a promotion? Or maybe he could find some leverage, something to keep her silent. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how fragile his position had become. In his mind, Joshua began to draft a plan. He would approach Elena, pretend to be remorseful, offer her anything she wanted. Maybe she would accept a quiet exit from the company, with a generous payout, of course. But deep down, he knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Elena wasn't someone who could be easily bought or intimidated. She was her father's daughter, after all. And if she had stayed in the shadows this long, it was because she had a plan of her own. The thought made his blood run cold. Joshua leaned back in his chair, staring at the photograph still fresh in his mind. He could feel the walls closing in on him, his power slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time in his career, he was truly afraid, not just of losing his position, but of being exposed for the man he had become. And as that fear grew, so did his determination to survive, no matter the cost. Joshua knew he had to act quickly, but even as he plotted his next move, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too late. Elena sat quietly in the break room, the usual hum of conversation replaced by the quiet murmur of her thoughts. The events of the past few days had been a whirlwind, but now she felt a new sense of clarity. She had a mission, and every moment of her father's legacy was fueling her resolve. Her father had always believed in justice, in fairness, and in treating people with respect. The values he instilled in her were more than just words. They were the guiding principles of her life, and she wasn't about to let them be trampled underfoot by someone like Joshua Graves. Carlos joined her, his presence as steadying as ever. He placed a cup of coffee in front of her and sat down, his eyes reflecting both concern and unwavering support. "We've got to be smart about this, Elena," he said, his voice low and measured. Joshua's not just going to sit back and let this happen. He's powerful, and he's got the board in his pocket. But we've got something he doesn't: truth. Elena nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup as she thought about their next move. "We need evidence, Carlos. Solid, undeniable proof of his misconduct, and not just what he did to me. We need to show a pattern, something that will make the board listen." Carlos leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've been talking to some of the other employees. They're scared, but they're tired of living in fear. There are stories, people he's bullied, others who've been forced out or silenced. If we can get them to talk, to share their experiences, we'll have a case that even the board can't ignore." Elena's eyes sharpened with determination. "We have to be careful, though. If Joshua gets wind of this before we're ready, he'll do everything in his power to shut us down. We need to work quietly, gathering everything we can before we make our move." The two of them spent the next few hours meticulously planning their strategy. Carlos had years of experience and a deep understanding of how the company worked, while Elena brought a fresh perspective and an unshakable belief in what they were doing. Together, they made a formidable team. They started by reaching out to those they trusted, employees who had been around long enough to witness Joshua's behavior, but who also had enough to lose that they would only speak out if they felt protected. It was a delicate balance, convincing people to share their stories without risking exposure before the time was right. As the day wore on, Elena found herself drawing strength from the memories of her father. She remembered the way he used to talk about the company, not as a machine or a money-making entity, but as a living, breathing community. He believed that every person mattered, that the success of the business depended on the happiness and well-being of its employees. That's why he had started the company in the first place, to create a place where people could thrive, not just survive. Elena felt her resolve harden. She wouldn't let his vision be destroyed by greed and cruelty. By the end of the day, Elena and Carlos had gathered enough preliminary evidence to start building their case. It was a start, but they both knew there was much more work to be done. The stories they had collected so far were heartbreaking. Tales of intimidation, of careers ruined, of dreams crushed under Joshua's relentless ambition. But they also found stories of resilience, of people who had endured and survived despite everything. These stories would be the backbone of their case, a testament to the strength of the employees and the corruption that needed to be rooted out. As the two of them reviewed their progress, Elena felt a flicker of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. "We're doing the right thing, Carlos," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about revenge. It's about justice. It's about making this company something my father would be proud of again." Carlos smiled, a rare sight these days, and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got his spirit, Elena, and we're going to see this through, no matter what." Elena nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The storm was gathering, and they were ready to face it head-on. They both knew that the coming days would be challenging, but with truth on their side and the memory of her father guiding her, Elena was prepared to take on whatever came next. The company was her father's legacy, and she was determined to protect it, no matter the cost. Joshua paced the length of his office, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. The usually pristine space now felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. He had always prided himself on maintaining control, on being the one to dictate the terms. But now, with the realization that Elena wasn't going to be silenced easily, his grip on the company and his own sanity was slipping. He could feel it in the way his hands trembled when he held his phone, in the way his thoughts raced with no clear direction. He had spent the better part of the day calling in favors, leaning on the board members who had once been loyal to him. They owed him, after all. He had made them wealthy, secured their positions, ensured their influence within the company. But as he spoke to each one, Joshua could hear the hesitation in their voices, the cautious distance they kept from his increasingly desperate tone. "You understand how important this is," he insisted, his voice strained as he spoke to yet another director. "We can't afford any instability right now. The market is watching us." The responses were all the same, vague reassurances, promises to look into it, but no real commitment. They were all hedging their bets, Joshua realized, unwilling to fully back him if it meant risking their own positions. It infuriated him, the way they danced around the issue, pretending to be on his side while quietly preparing for his downfall. He slammed the phone down after the last call, his anger boiling over. "Cowards," he muttered under his breath. Every last one of them. Desperation clawed at him as he considered his next move. If the board wouldn't back him, he would have to find another way to deal with Elena. He could spread rumors, make her out to be unhinged, a troublemaker with a vendetta against the company. He even entertained the idea of planting evidence, something to discredit her before she could do any real damage. But even as he thought it, Joshua knew it wouldn't be enough. Elena had been careful, methodical. She wasn't just a disgruntled employee, she was the founder's daughter, and that made her untouchable in ways he couldn't easily counter. The thought of her revealing his cruelty to the world sent a shiver down his spine. He imagined the headlines, the fallout. G-Tech's image, carefully crafted over decades, would be tarnished beyond repair, and with it, his own reputation. Joshua could see it all crumbling around him, the empire he had built on the back of his ambition and ruthlessness disintegrating into dust. The gnawing fear that had been growing inside him for days now consumed him, making it impossible to think clearly. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the company had begun to shift, and it hadn't gone unnoticed by Joshua. The employees seemed more united, moving through the hallways with a quiet determination that made him uneasy. There were whispers, too low for him to catch, but enough to let him know that something was brewing beneath the surface. It was as if the entire company was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Joshua could sense it in the way people looked at him now, not with the usual deference or fear, but with something else, something that unsettled him deeply. He had always commanded respect, had always been the one to set the tone, but now that authority was slipping away. The employees weren't just going through the motions anymore. They were waiting for something, and it terrified him. His once unshakable confidence was eroding, replaced by a growing paranoia. He could feel the edges of his control fraying, the threads of his carefully woven narrative unraveling, and the more he tried to tighten his grip, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. Joshua knew he was running out of time. He could see the writing on the wall, even if he refused to fully acknowledge it. His empire was teetering on the brink, and unless he could find a way to regain control, it would all come crashing down. But as the hours ticked by and his plans grew more desperate, the fear gnawing at him only deepened. He was no longer the master of his own fate, and the realization of just how vulnerable he had become was almost too much to bear. The grand hall at G-Tech headquarters was abuzz with energy as employees filled the space, chatting and laughing in anticipation of the company's annual Employee Appreciation Day. It was one of the few events where the entire workforce came together, from the highest executives to the janitorial staff. The hall was adorned with banners and decorations, a testament to the company's outward show of unity and success. Yet beneath the festive atmosphere, a current of tension ran through the crowd, subtle but undeniable, as if everyone sensed that something momentous was about to happen. Elena stood off to the side, watching as the hall filled up. Dressed in simple, business-like attire, she was almost unrecognizable from the janitor everyone had known. Her demeanor was calm, but inside, her heart pounded with a mix of anxiety and resolve. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, listening to the stories of her fellow employees, and crafting a presentation that would lay bare the truth of what had been happening under Joshua's leadership. Carlos stood beside her, offering quiet words of encouragement, his presence a steadying force in the midst of her nervousness. As the event began, Joshua took the stage first, his voice booming over the loudspeakers as he delivered a speech full of the usual platitudes about teamwork, dedication, and the company's bright future. But there was a stiffness to his words, a lack of the usual confidence that those who knew him well could sense. He scanned the room, trying to gauge the mood of the crowd, but the usual applause felt more muted, the smiles less genuine. When he finished, the polite clapping was a far cry from the enthusiastic response he usually commanded. Then it was Elena's turn. She stepped onto the stage with a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment as all eyes turned to her. Joshua watched her from the side, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. The room fell silent as the lights dimmed and the first slide of her presentation appeared on the screen behind her. a graph showing a steep decline in employee morale over the past few years. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the audience, but Elena didn't waver. Her voice was steady as she began to speak, explaining how the decline was not just a result of external factors, but directly linked to the toxic environment cultivated by the company's leadership. The presentation moved from statistics to testimonials, with videos of employees recounting their experiences, how they had been belittled, ignored, or driven out by Joshua's harsh and often cruel management style. Faces in the audience began to change, the initial curiosity giving way to shock and discomfort. Joshua's face flushed red as he watched, his fists clenching at his sides. He could feel the control slipping away from him, the carefully constructed image of himself as a powerful and benevolent leader crumbling in front of his eyes. Elena pressed on, showing emails and memos that revealed a pattern of intimidation and disregard for employee welfare. As the evidence mounted, the gasps grew louder, and whispers of disbelief spread through the hall. The board members, seated in a row near the front, exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to alarm. They could see the mood of the room turning against them, the realization dawning that this was no ordinary presentation, but an indictment of their own complacency. Finally, Elena reached the end of her presentation. The last slide was a photograph, the same one Joshua had seen in that mysterious email. The company's founder, William Daniels, with his young daughter. The audience fell into a stunned silence as Elena turned to face them fully. "My name is Elena Daniels," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I am the daughter of William Daniels, the founder of this company. I took on the role of a janitor to understand the true state of G-Tech, and what I've found is heartbreaking. This company, which my father built on the values of respect, integrity, and care for its employees, has lost its way. But that ends today." The room erupted in shocked gasps and murmurs as the weight of Elena's words settled over the audience. Joshua stood frozen, his face drained of color as he stared at Elena in disbelief. The board members looked at each other, their unease growing into full-blown panic. They knew they were now facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Elena's unveiling had not only exposed Joshua, but also put them all in the spotlight for their failure to uphold the company's founding principles. Elena stepped down from the stage, the room still buzzing with the impact of her revelation. She felt the eyes of every employee on her, not as a janitor, but as the rightful heir to the company's legacy. Joshua could only watch, his mind racing with fear and desperation, knowing that his empire was on the brink of collapse, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The boardroom at G-Tech was a stark contrast to the Grand Hall, where the company's Employee Appreciation Day had taken place just hours earlier. The usual air of confidence that filled the room was gone, replaced by a heavy tension that settled over the board members like a suffocating blanket. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in muted light, and the long polished table that dominated the center seemed colder and more imposing than ever. Joshua sat at the head of the table, his usual commanding presence diminished as he faced the grim faces of the board. The emergency meeting had been called immediately after Elena's presentation, and the urgency of the situation was palpable. Joshua could feel the eyes of the board members on him, no longer deferential but scrutinizing, evaluating him with a new, unforgiving intensity. He had spent years cultivating their loyalty, but now, in this moment, he realized just how fragile that loyalty was. "This is all a misunderstanding," Joshua began, his voice strained as he struggled to regain control. "I've always acted in the best interest of the company. My decisions, though difficult, were necessary to maintain order and efficiency. You all know the pressures we face." But his words were cut off by a sharp interjection from one of the senior board members, a man named Richard with gray hair and a stern expression. "Joshua, we've seen the evidence," Richard said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This isn't about maintaining order. It's about a pattern of behavior that has eroded the very foundation of this company. We can't ignore what's been brought to light, not after today. The employees are losing faith, and if we don't act, the market will too. Joshua's heart pounded in his chest, his desperation mounting as he tried to think of a way to salvage the situation. He leaned forward, his voice rising with urgency. This company needs strong leadership, now more than ever. You know me, you know what I've done for G-Tech. I've brought us through challenging times before. We can weather this storm, but we have to stay united. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of support, but all he found were stony, unreadable faces. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions betraying the weight of the decision before them. There was a long, uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Finally, another board member, a woman named Margaret, who had always been a voice of reason, spoke up. Joshua, we appreciate your contributions to the company, but this is bigger than any one person. We have a responsibility to the employees, to the shareholders, and to the legacy of William Daniels. The evidence presented today leaves us no choice. The finality in her words sent a chill down Joshua's spine. He could feel the walls closing in on him, his options narrowing to a point of no return. He opened his mouth to protest, to plead, but before he could speak, Richard cleared his throat and addressed the room. It's time for a vote. All those in favor of removing Joshua Graves from his position as CEO, please indicate by raising your hand. One by one, hands began to rise around the table, each one a nail in the coffin of Joshua's career. He watched in stunned silence, his mind reeling as the reality of his downfall set in. When the last hand was raised, Richard turned back to Joshua, his expression unreadable. The decision is unanimous. Effective immediately, you are removed as CEO of G-Tech. The words hit Joshua like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. He had never imagined that his empire could be taken from him so swiftly, so completely. The room was spinning, and for a moment, all he could hear was the roaring in his ears. As Joshua struggled to process what had just happened, the door to the boardroom opened, and Elena stepped in. She was calm, composed, a stark contrast to the chaos in Joshua's mind. Richard spoke again, this time addressing Elena directly. Elena, the board recognizes your deep understanding of this company and your commitment to its values. We would like to offer you a leadership role to guide G-Tech back to its roots. Elena paused, her gaze steady as she considered the offer. She knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for the entire company. Finally, she shook her head. Thank you, but I must decline. This company was never meant to be led by a single person. My father believed in collective leadership, in empowering employees at every level. That's how we can truly honor his legacy, by creating a model of leadership that is inclusive, that values every voice. Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with the board members, who nodded in agreement. They had just witnessed the consequences of centralized power, and Elena's vision for a more inclusive future offered a way forward. As she left the room, the weight of the day's events began to settle over the board. They had removed Joshua, but their work was far from over. The task of rebuilding G-Tech lay ahead, and it would require more than just a change in leadership. It would require a fundamental shift in how the company was run. Joshua sat in stunned silence as the meeting adjourned, his mind a whirlwind of fear, anger, and disbelief. The empire he had built, the power he had wielded so ruthlessly, was gone. And as he watched the board members file out, he realized that he was truly alone, left to confront the wreckage of his own making. The corridors of G-Tech felt different now, humming with a new energy as the company began to heal from the chaos of the past months. The transformation was palpable, a shift in the very air that filled the sleek, modern building. Gone were the tense, fearful faces that once hurried through the hallways. In their place were expressions of quiet optimism and determination. The employees had been through a storm, but now, with a new leadership team in place, there was a sense of collective ownership and pride that hadn't been felt in years. The new leadership team, selected with careful consideration, embodied the values that William Daniels had always envisioned for the company. They were leaders who believed in transparency, in treating employees with respect, and in fostering a culture where everyone felt heard. Weekly meetings were now open forums where employees could voice their ideas and concerns, and the once rigid hierarchy had given way to a more collaborative environment. It was a breath of fresh air for many who had grown disillusioned under Joshua's rule. Elena, though she chose to remain in her humble role, had become an unofficial mentor and advisor to many within the company. Her quiet strength and the story of her journey from janitor to the rightful heir had inspired others to believe in the possibility of change. She was often sought out for her insights on company culture, and her presence in the building was a constant reminder of the company's roots and the importance of staying true to its founding principles. Yet Elena never sought recognition or praise. For her, the real reward was seeing the company transform into a place where people were valued, just as her father had always intended. One afternoon, Elena found herself walking through the corridors of G-Tech, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. The light streaming through the large windows cast a warm glow on the walls, and she paused for a moment to take it all in. These hallways had once felt cold and oppressive, but now they were filled with life, with the buzz of creativity and collaboration. She passed by a group of employees engaged in a spirited discussion about a new project, their laughter and enthusiasm filling the air. It was a stark contrast to the atmosphere that had once pervaded these halls. As she continued her walk, Elena's thoughts drifted to her father. She could almost hear his voice, full of wisdom and kindness, reminding her of the importance of integrity and compassion in leadership. He had always believed that a company was only as strong as its people, and that true success came not from profits alone, but from the well-being of those who made it all possible. Elena smiled to herself, knowing that his legacy was alive and well, not just in the physical building or the brand, but in the hearts and minds of the people who worked there. She paused by a large portrait of her father that hung in the main lobby, a recent addition commissioned by the new leadership team. It showed him as she remembered him best, calm, wise, with a gentle smile that reflected his belief in the goodness of people. Beneath the portrait was a plaque that read, "In honor of William Daniels, founder of G-Tech, a leader of integrity and vision." Elena touched the edge of the frame lightly, a gesture of quiet reverence. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "We brought your vision back to life." As she stood there, a sense of peace washed over her. The company was no longer the toxic environment it had become under Joshua's reign. It was a place where people felt valued, where their contributions mattered, and where the future looked bright. Elena knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always more work to be done. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The company her father had built was once again a beacon of hope and opportunity, and she was proud to be a part of its ongoing story. Elena turned to leave the lobby, her heart light as she walked away from the portrait. The company was in good hands now, guided by leaders who understood the true meaning of leadership, not as a means of wielding power, but as a way to uplift and empower others. As she made her way back to her office, she passed by employees who greeted her with genuine smiles and nods of respect. The corridors, once cold and uninviting, now felt like home, a place where her father's legacy would continue to grow and thrive, not just in the structure of the company, but in the spirit of its people. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.